Have you ever felt stuck in life, or perhaps like you keep recreating a similar situation over and over again? Maybe it's attracting the same type of romantic partner, or ending up in the same type of dead-end job, or perhaps you just keep getting into a depressive cycle and you really don't understand what's going on. Well, a lot of this is actually attributed to childhood trauma. And so by the end of this video, we'll actually understand where childhood trauma comes from, and then also what we can do today to start healing it. As Carl Jung said, his quote is, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." And so this video is about uncovering those hidden wounds so that we can take back our life and take back our fate in some way. So essentially something to open up and share with you as well, just my own personal life, is through my life, I've gone through various bouts of depression, through suicidal ideation, through addiction and substance use, addiction to pornography, addiction to marijuana, addiction to nicotine, validation seeking, addiction to money, etc. And really all of these addictions were coping mechanisms and attempts to help cope what was going on inside of my nervous system. And a lot of what this pressure I was feeling actually comes from and came from childhood trauma. And so as we talk about trauma, it's really important to understand that there can be essentially two different types of trauma. We have what we call big T traumas, which could be like a divorce of a parent, it could be the death of a family member, it could be a car wreck, some kind of instant, one-time catastrophic event. And then we also have what we call little T traumas. And these little T traumas are a little bit more subtle, and they occur a lot more frequently within the family. This could be the little T trauma of a mother belittling, their child for not getting an A on a test. Oh, you got an A minus or you got a B plus, why didn't you get an A? Those little traumas that are created inside of the family unit shape one's sense of self-worth and identity. And so as we understand this concept of childhood trauma, it's really important to understand one fundamental core concept. This concept actually comes from Gabor Mate, and what he essentially says is that a child's need for connection with their caregivers is greater than their need for authenticity. And so what this means is that as a child, our survival need to make sure that we had food and shelter and that we were taken care of depended on our connection with our caregivers. And so there were some times when we interacted with our caregivers that they praised us for certain behaviors, and then they kind of shamed or sort of put down other behaviors. Maybe you were too loud as a child, so every time you got too loud, you learned to stifle yourself, and that energy is still in there, but it doesn't have the ability to express itself. And so those little T traumas are just as coercive as some of those big T traumas. One thing about a big T trauma that's really advantageous, as much of an oxymoron as that is with trauma, is that typically we know with those bigger T traumas, big abuse or some sort of catastrophic event, that's kind of where our work is. We can kind of point towards something and recognize that that's where our trauma is. And then with these little T traumas, it can be a little bit more subtle and coercive. I know with the clients that I work with and in doing my own work with my own therapist that, I had considered myself to come from a good family. And there's nothing wrong with having, parents who try their best and did what they can with what they were given. And at the same time, understanding and recognizing that no family doesn't have dysfunction. I understand that's a double negative, but essentially what I'm trying to say is that every single family has dysfunction. And that's okay. That's just a part of being human and a part of the survival skills and part of the cycle. However, at the same time, it's important to understand that so we can kind of put the blinders of denial away and start really opening up and seeing what happened to us. So today, if you're feeling perhaps suicidal ideation, if you're feeling depression, if you're feeling stuck in life, if you feel like you try and make money and you constantly self-sabotage, there are countless examples here. Addiction, having trouble in relationships, trust issues, etc. Typically what we could do is point back to our childhood and recognize that ages 0 to 10 were extremely fundamental years for our development as a human. Basically, those years, we're like sponges. Those were formative years of our life, and they basically formed our entire perception of reality. And so the relationships that we had or didn't have with our primary caregivers really sort of set the foundations for the rest of our life. Did our primary caregivers give us enough trust to be able to actually trust that our needs are going to get met in a healthy time, or were they kind of busy doing their own thing? Or maybe it was 50-50, or maybe I only had one parent in the house and the other parent was absent. And so trying to understand a little bit more about our childhood can actually understand why we enact certain behavior patterns today. Most of our behavior patterns are mimicked or copied from our caregivers. The relationships that we get into might even mimic those of our parents' relationships or our primary caregivers' relationships. So starting to recognize these things can really start to help you to understand a little bit more about what happened to you. And so one way you can actually go about doing this is if you allow yourself to feel. What childhood trauma doesn't want us to do is basically feel what happened to us because it wasn't safe to do so at the time. Essentially, the way that we're defining trauma here is anything that is too taxing for the nervous system to process. And that could be anything. It could be, an infant staring at her mother and her mother turning her gaze away from the child. In that moment to that child, that's a traumatic incident, even though the mother had no intent of, hurting the child, and maybe the mom was looking towards other children to make sure that everything was okay, but the infant didn't perceive that because the child is in what the psychology world we call egosyntonic, which means that the child sees the world through the lens that I am responsible for everything. The child sees that everything is a cause of what they do, and that's okay. That's just part of the developmental process, and coming through that process is having a mature adult understanding that not everything is our fault, that child's egosyntonic nature actually makes it so that anything that happens becomes their fault. So if the parents get divorced, it becomes the child's fault. They take on the shame for that. If something happens like a sexual abuse or some other kind of abuse, the child takes that on. Oh, it must be my fault. I didn't, whatever. I wasn't protecting myself. I didn't dress right. Or, the child takes that shame on as a way to try and control what happened to them. And in doing so, they take on and introject the abusive person's behavior patterns. And so essentially what we're trying to get at here is this theme that every single one of us carries wounds. And inside of each one of these wounds is a gift. And these wounds are painful and they're not always easy to go into. And yet with help and, community and support with other people and different exercises and skills, we can go into these wounds and begin the healing process. And we can recognize that these wounds that we were so afraid of touching actually have immense amount of creative power, because these wounds actually point the way to our authenticity, because it was our authentic core that was actually hurt in the process. So there are definitely a couple of ways in particular as men that this may show up, and this could show up for women as well, but addressing men in particular in this video, one of the ways that this mainly shows up is emotional avoidance. Many of us were taught as children that it wasn't okay to cry, it wasn't okay to laugh, it wasn't okay to play, it wasn't okay to essentially express ourselves as who we really were. And so as children, especially as little boys, I remember in my childhood constantly getting shamed for crying. I was told not to cry, I was told to man up, don't be a wuss, etc. And I essentially learned as a child that it wasn't okay to feel my feelings, that I had to stiffen up my upper lip and try and block out any kind of feeling that came near me. It was really embarrassing if I cried in front of my male peers, and it just wasn't something I was about. And so today I've had to retrain and relearn how to do that in front of other people, especially in front of other men in safe and vulnerable spaces that allow me to process these things. Another way that this trauma pattern may show up is in difficulty building trust and intimacy with others, especially with romantic partners. If, we have difficulty building trust today, we can actually look back, especially to the early attachment to our mother. The mother and the child, that early intimate connection and relationship is so intertwined and so subconscious and so subtle. The child is so tuned into the mother. And, in psychology, we actually view that even after the child comes out of the womb, the mother and the child are still one unit. They are still so much in oneness and union with each other. There's this constant regulation of each other's nervous systems. And so if we grew up with a mom who is extremely frantic and anxious all the time, the child then absorbs that anxiety and that frantic nature. If we grew up without a mom, we didn't have the ability to start trusting the world, or if we grew up with a mom who had some trust but eventually became so dependent and needy on the child giving them a sense of essentially the child meeting their emotional needs. Sometimes, men become the surrogate spouse for the mother if things aren't going too well in the relationship. And so we have difficulty building intimacy and trust in our current relationships. A lot of this can be pointed back to our early primary relationship with our mother. And these early attachment wounds. Many men today are what we would consider falling into the avoidant category, that they kind of try and keep, others at a distance so that they don't let anyone in to actually hurt themselves. Many men also struggle with self-worth and identity issues. A lot of the essence and core of masculinity is wrapped around this idea of not feeling good enough, not being wanted in the household, not being validated for who we really are. If we didn't have our emotional needs met, which our emotions are who we are, there's this intrinsic sense of I'm not good enough that develops inside. And one common condition of any form of childhood trauma is shame. Shame is the emotion that I am unworthy, I am not good enough. Ultimately, shame says I am unworthy of love. And so that shame gets carried around in men. And sometimes that shame gets expressed through, violent outbursts, through anger, through a deep sense of helplessness, and through constantly trying to collect material things or have others give them a sense of validation. All this stems from shame and identity issues around not being wanted or accepted completely as for who they are. And ultimately, to heal this wound, we do need to be the ones to accept ourselves. And then one of the most common indicators of childhood trauma is repeating patterns unconsciously in our life. Kind of what we talked about at the beginning of the video, but just like unconsciously doing the same thing over and over again. That's the psyche's way of trying to heal something, but it's unconscious. It keeps happening. I keep ending up with the same types of partners. I keep ending up in the same type of relationship, in the same type of job. The same things keep happening to me over and over again. That's a sign of childhood trauma, that there's a repetitive pattern, that something's attempting to be worked out inside of the psyche. And just as Carl Jung said, if we keep ending up in the same patterns, until we make that conscious, it's going to keep happening, and we'll call it fate. It's just going to keep happening over and over again. The psyche will put itself into situations as an attempt to be healed. And sometimes the healing happens and sometimes it doesn't. So a couple of steps that we can start taking today towards healing and starting to work through some of this stuff is, one, first and foremost, asking for help. I know for men it can be really difficult to ask for help. And just even acknowledging that, you're stuck and need someone or something to support you could be a huge step to recognize that it's okay to have needs. It's okay to be dependent on other people. And as a matter of fact, we are dependent on other people. And that's completely fine. There's nothing wrong with that. We don't need to have a complete 100% sense of independence in this world. It's really important also to start recognizing these patterns. I really recommend journaling, even just free stream writing consciousness. If you can do 3 pages or set a 10-minute timer and just write stream of consciousness, let anything come up, maybe have a topic of, maybe like some previous memories or what could my childhood patterns be, and then allowing yourself to write on this for a couple of minutes, just starting to bring awareness to it, just allowing whatever starts to come up. Another thing we can really do to start working with childhood trauma is start practicing vulnerability by opening up to people in safe spaces. For instance, like I myself am a trained counselor, so I have the ability to help others and listen to others in a confidential way that allows them to give space. So if, you did need to find a coach or a therapist or perhaps even a men's group, that's something that you can do in order to start just working with these wounds and to start practicing opening up and being vulnerable around other people. And then also the biggest thing is reconnecting with your body. I really recommend anything from yoga to breath work to meditation to really just start coming back into the body, because essentially what trauma does is it disconnects one from the body and gets them living up in the head as a way to defend against all the feelings that are occurring inside of the body. So with that, thank you so much for tuning in. If you would like to work with me one-on-one, I am currently taking on clients. You can click the link in the description below. If you wouldn't mind liking and subscribing, it's completely free to do, and it helps this channel get into YouTube's algorithm. And then also if you're on Spotify, if you would please leave a rating. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll catch you in the next one. Take care.